So everybody, get ready. All right. So let's give a big, huge startup grind welcome to Charles Adler. Woo! I know it can be a little bit unnerving.
You want to sit on that side, right?
I know I'm superstitious about this for some reason. But welcome. Thank you. I'm sure everybody's heard of that thing, Kickstarter. We'll get to that. But so Charles and I have actually spent some time together and gotten to know you. And for those of you that have been to Startup Grind in the past, I have sort of this theory about startup founders and such. But we're going to set that aside, and we'll come back around. But let's start with you.
We'll be drinking by then, I think.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So let's go way back. Tell us about your childhood. Where'd you grow up? What were you doing? And why?
That's open-ended.
Yes, it is.
All right, so I'll just start from somewhere. I was born overseas in the UK. Is that far back enough?
That's far back.
Yeah. Parents moved to the States when I was 2 years old. Grew up in what I sort of affectionately call the land of Martha Stewart, Westport, Connecticut, little town just outside of Manhattan, outside of New York. I guess a pretty normal childhood, particularly for Connecticut. So the usual thing that happens in Connecticut is parents get divorced. So my parents did that, and they checked that off their list. I don't know, what more do you want? I guess, I was a bit of a loner, I guess, in many extents of the term. I think I was a skater. I was into cycling when everyone else was into football, baseball, and the usual American things. I sort of was into other things, I guess. And I guess in some way that's defined quite a bit of who I am today, for whatever reason.
And tell us about, you traveled quite a bit, right, as a kid? Yeah,
so, outside of moving from UK to the States, my dad was in a business that allowed him to travel, or forced him to travel, I guess, and allowed me to kind of come along with. And I think kind of where this maybe is going, or what we're reflecting on, is travel is actually a really important part of my life. It's just the interest that I have just in culture and exploring different cultures around the world, or even in the Midwest. And I guess that's translated. This isn't really a professional thing, but it's translated perhaps in a bit of a restlessness that I have. Little thing about me is I move every couple of years. So I moved here a year ago from New York, where I was living for 4 years. In the span of the 7 years that I was doing Kickstarter, from nothing to what it is now, I met my co-founders in New York. 6 months later, moved to California. 12 months after that, moved here. A year and a half after that, moved to New York. And then 4 years later, or 3.5 years later, moved back here. So
that's very cool.
That extrapolating back is pretty constant for some reason.
I think when I first met you, somebody described it as you were on a walkabout.
So I probably said this. Yeah, now I don't have a job, right, in the normal sense. So I have to come up with something. So I sort of describe that I'm a flaneur on Walkabout. Flaneur is sort of an observer, urban explorer, if you will. Yeah, I'm just sort of taking a look at what's going on in the world now, and travel's part of that, as well as making sure that I spend enough time in Chicago to kind of observe what's going on here with
and we're
you guys.
Glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. But where did you go to school? Where did you go to college?
So I grew up on the East Coast. How many people went to school in a city or state that they didn't grow up in? A few, good. Okay, so probably similar motivations. I wanted to get the F away from my family and sort of
you
reinvent.
You can say fuck, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure I can. Someone will edit that out. So I wanted to get the fuck away from my family. And so I went to school out here in the Midwest. I went to Purdue down in Indiana, which was a pretty awesome existence for the 5 years that I was there. I think it was like something like 5 years. And I say that because it was a sort of microscopic urban environment, right? It's basically a factory town that's surrounded by cornfields. It's pretty safe. And so one can rediscover themselves in many ways in a town like that. But you know, I think the other piece was it was also sort of independent. I was independent, and you know, a lot happened in that era. I think it was also sort of a point of self-reflection and a point of probably doing more than just my schoolwork, which kind of bit me in the ass later. But we can talk about that. Maybe there's a question in there. I don't know.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
So while there, did you start contemplating doing something on your own? I mean, I don't...
Yeah. You know, I think as a kid, I always admired those that were doing creative endeavors, musicians, artists, and so forth. Even, you know, a lot of my idols were skaters and graffiti artists and photographers and poets and cyclists. I'm a cycling guy. And I recognize, maybe this is sort of a modern me reflection of the earlier me, but A, recognize these were not really popular endeavors. And B, thought it was even more, there's something very romantic about the idea of, or at least for me, of these people doing something that was not, it was fairly, I guess the term would be underground, right? Subversive or cultural intent. And when I was in school, in the middle of an industrial town in farm country, I think I was talking to somebody earlier here about my interest in electronic music and music in general. And at the time, I sort of got introduced to DJing, or I sort of started exploring my deeper interest in music when I was in school. And that led to a further connection to other people who were making music, who were actually talented at making music outside of myself. And then starting to do sort of barters with them. So at this time, this was in the early to mid 90s, I went to school for engineering. So maybe I back up just like half a second, because I think we'll get into maybe my interest in design, but there's an earlier story there. So as a kid, I was fascinated with making things, as probably many kids are. And the sort of expression of that for when I grew up, meaning the job that I was interested in, was being an architect. And my father sort of slowly convinced me that was a failed dream, and crushed that dream slowly but surely. And so I ended up going to school for engineering, mechanical engineering, which was also a wrong turn, because I realized a couple of years in that I really wasn't interested in where that was going, or where that was going to lead me. I think it just so happened in that period of time, I think maybe the mix of the things that I was kind of mucking about with at 4 a.m, that allowed me to barter music for services like design work. And this other thing that happened, which was the internet, and then the web layered on top of it, led me to a point basically to decide to drop out of school. So I dropped out of school in 1995 and then moved up here. And so that was my first introduction to Chicago, was the 90s era of this city, which actually this part of the city was incredibly different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be here.
I would, actually, probably doing something other than this.
When you came up here, did you get a gig right away, or what were you doing?
So I guess I hung out with a lot of dropouts. So a buddy of mine who's an engineer, like programmer, he had dropped out of school and came to go work at a studio up here, where his roommate had actually graduated and gotten a job up here. Small little boutique.
Him.
Yeah, I know, right? Small little design firm up here. And so I'd interned there for a summer, which was the sort of recognition that I'm really good at working. I'm not so good at following instruction in a school setting. And anyway, so I ended up going back and working there. So yeah, I had a gig.
And at that point, was it as a designer or?
Yeah. So this was a, the wild Midwest, I guess. The Wild West in those days, right? So, designer, developer, I don't know what, a good expression for me, I guess, in looking back at that period of time. So I left and started working at this, I was employee number 12, let's say, right? A small little company. We got acquired by an agency of like 2,000 people, later grew to 4,000. And when the acquisition, the sort of M&A, mergers and acquisition process was going on, or that was over, and we were getting assimilated, the HR director had flown out from New York and sat with each one of us, all 12 of us, to figure out, like, what are we going to do? And so she asked me, she's like, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to be a designer or a developer? And I just looked at her and said, yeah, right? Anybody have problems with kind of division of labor stuff? Yeah. So, the term now is generalist, right? Jack of nothing. I tinkered my way into doing web stuff. I tinkered my way into doing design, and so I kind of did both, I guess. And then I lost that battle and chose design because there's so much happening in development, and it wasn't my passion as much from a tangible standpoint. I was far more interested in the design piece, and then I realized I wasn't. And what I mean by that, we were doing client work, and I just really wasn't interested in the subjectivity of that kind of work. So I got into this other skill called information architecture. Mm-hmm. So I eventually became an architect. Right. Fuck you, Dad. Yeah.
So
and I didn't have to pay all that money or spend all that time. Anyway.
That's right. So you got absorbed into this bigger agency. What happened then? Is that when you transitioned to New York, or what was?
True. So, actually, I'm still trying to figure this out about myself. But I lasted at this company for like 10 years, and I think I say that only because a lot of people around me were flipping jobs, including my then girlfriend, now wife, and she was constantly like, "Get the fuck out of there! Like, get another job." And it just wasn't part of my MO. Like, I really appreciated and valued the friends that I'd made. A lot of them were the close ties were people that I'd worked with at this 12-person company that we got sort of indoctrinated into this larger place. But I think the bigger thing was it also enabled, because it was an international company, so they had offices all over the States and all over the world, I got to travel a lot. So full circle, like I got to kind of fulfill something, although that kind of travel is far less glamorous, but it was something.
And so 10 years,
mm-hmm.
And at some point in time in that 10 years, you did end up in New York, or?
Yeah. So the last, my last bit was in New York. I'd moved from Chicago to New York, and probably about a year or two afterwards quit. Kind of under, well, anyway, I don't know. I just quit. I had sort of broken my, so I had, I'll explain it. Maybe these points of tension are good. So I had seen this company grow, and then there's a term that I love called shit the bed, right? So it sort of hit rock bottom. And we would lose in these sort of moments. We would lose all of our friends, right? So we hired all these people. We rode that wave for a moment, and these people that you've spent like a good amount of time getting to know suddenly disappear, and that really sunk in pretty deep. But I got to stick around, probably because I was a workaholic, and so I sort of survived through a lot of these rounds, and it was this, I a very visceral memory of this exchange. The last job that I had at this company was that of a partner, client partner, account guy. Not really my favorite role, to be frank, but it sort of ended up there. I'd done just about every other job there was at the company. And outside of just not being totally psyched about what my everyday was, there was this one comment that my boss had made as we were getting off the plane, going to the client who I was in charge of. And I was bringing him into to meet the client. And he's like, "Charles, don't think I won't fire you if you don't perform." And I just thought to myself, here's a guy threatening me to a guy who's been with this company for almost since the beginning, through thick and thin. He had been laid off and brought back, by the way. And it was sort of at that moment where I just said, fuck you. I got to figure something else out. So the romantic part of this, I suppose, is that I bought a Mac, and then I quit 2 weeks later, given 3 weeks notice, and then started my own studio in New York. It was actually at that point where I sort of started talking to my wife, trying to figure out where are we gonna stay in New York, because I'm a bit of a nomad. We're gonna stay in New York. I'd been there for 2 years, I think, at that point. New York is a highly competitive city, especially for design. Do I want to start my studio there, or do I want to come here? We opted to stay there, I think, thankfully, in some capacity, but yeah.
Did you gain any traction?
So I think it's one of the things I talk a bit about, which is these cliffs we jump off of, and that was like a cliff. Dropping out of school was, I suppose, a bit of a cliff. And what I mean by that is that there's this perception that it's this great big leap of whatever. You're jumping into this abyss. And I think it was this moment, quitting this job at that point in time, that I recognized that it wasn't quite that. And what I mean by that is, so I didn't know how to do business development. I was still trying to figure out, like, what kind of work did I want to do, and how would I get that work, and then how would that work sustain me financially in New York. I guess I was just lucky that I feel like I'm a pretty honest person, and I treat people fairly well, and I work hard, and I think that paid back. And what I mean by that is what I started recognizing was, within a few weeks, old colleagues would start calling, "Hey, can you help out?" Some of it was back at the old agency, which was sort of ironic. At first, I also went through this phase where, so I'd worked for 10 years at a big company, and I'd done a lot of side projects on the side, but they were never economically driven. We should talk about those, actually. They're probably more interesting than this whole thing. So I went through this phase where I knew I had to do some research, and I knew I learned by doing. So I started subcontracting to other smaller studios in and around New York. And that was sort of a sense of understanding the culture of smaller studios that were doing more interesting work, I felt, than the larger agencies, as well as, honestly, like, build up a Rolodex, if you will, of designers that I can lean on and developers that I can lean on that were freelance. Yeah.
Well, I mean, tell us about some of those ideas or concepts that you were working on the side.
Okay, so I was mentioning that in school, I was doing a lot of like label artwork for record labels, or websites for some of these record labels when that became a thing. And when I went to work, meaning, got a real job when I dropped out of school, the work satiated only a part of what I was interested in with the web. And that is to say, it got me to play with some pretty advanced technology, gave me a lot of independence because, look, we were a small studio trying to grow and doing a lot of work, so I was given a lot of responsibility. Everybody was sort of given a lot of responsibility. But the one thing that was missing was this connection back to the arts. And I suppose there's that, and as a lonely DJ moving into a city which is effectively known for dance music and DJs, meaning there's a glut of them up here. And so I sort of fused, I suppose, 3 things that I was curious about. One was design and technology. So I built a little website that was, in those days, it was in 96 or 97, that I hosted under my desk. You used to be able to do that, right? Anybody know Real Networks? This company, Real Networks, a couple people, yeah. So they had basically create software for streaming audio online, which is not that big a deal anymore, but it was back in 95, 96. And they had a free version of their software, so I basically hobbled together 2 or 3 of their servers. They had a limit of 25 streams. I wanted to get more streams, so I probably did something fairly against their terms and conditions, but whatever. So I strung together, sort of hacked together this technology and designed this little site to basically turn my apartment into a club, but a virtual one. And so I'd invite a couple of friends over that were DJ. We would do a 3-hour set every other Tuesday night, rotation. Everyone gets an hour, and then every week there would be a whole new lineup of people. And the only requirement is that you bring somebody else next week. Right, and so it was a way for all of us to kind of meet around the thing that we cared about, and there was from a brand perspective, which I don't really tend to think too much about. There was continuity, so there was some sense of trust in that. Hey, I know you, I know the music. You're in my fucking house. I trust that you're going to bring somebody in my house that is okay, and is also going to play great music. And then it just becomes a nice little cultural exchange. Sadly, I moved apartments, and so that was also around the time when ISPs caught on to this act of hosting under your bed, and so that became an impossibility. The other thing that was going on was Metallica and the government were not happy with people stealing music, apparently. So they would haul in like 13-year-old girls and like 85-year-old grandmothers and put them on the stand. And it was really like the 14-year-old brother.
Thank you, Sean Parker. Isn't that the guy?
Yeah. So this was Napster era, totally. Yeah, Sean. Awesome. And so there's this organization called RIA, which is the Recording Institute of something or other America. I don't know. It's horrible. And so what they were doing, they basically squashed this idea that I had for this. The project was called Subsistence, and basically they made it impossible for me to run this basically ham radio from my apartment because I would have to pay royalties to musicians that, God help me, they couldn't find because I was personal friends with a number of them. And so I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want to get the thing shut down. So I reinvented it with one of the guys that I'd met through the project. And we turned it into kind of like an online magazine. And at that point, it was really around, I'd learned a number of things over the years so that we had run that project and met a whole slew of people outside of music, artists and so forth, in and around. This was all in Chicago, by the way. And basically turned it into a publication to publish artists who had no place to go, right? It was a halfway house for artists, I guess, on the internet. And so we would publish like poetry and visual art and interactive art and music, but instead of recorded mixes, it was original music so we could get around the RIA thing. And then I moved to New York. And so did my co-collaborator on this thing, and we sort of shut the thing down. But that leads a little bit to a narrative, I suppose, of Kickstarter or why Kickstarter, and I think a bit of what it, at least for me, like what it represented.
Yeah, well, let's keep riffing on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I shut down sort of version 2 of Subsistence in, I don't know, let's call it 94. I don't even know.
Well,
or 2004.
So why did you shut it down? I mean, I know you guys moved, 2 co-founders moved, but why?
So, well, my friend, co-collaborator on this thing had gone to grad school. I was moving to New York. I think it just felt like it was going to be too much. It was a lot of work. Like, we put a lot of heart and soul into this thing, and it was just a lot of work, and I think we overcommitted. And I was getting a new job in New York, and it just felt too much. And we just, I also would argue that good things don't last, right? So there was that. And there was, it wasn't making us any money. We weren't trying to make any money from it. There was never any conversation around that. It was what it was. It was a side project. I have, in sort of modern times, talked about bringing it back in some capacity, but we'll see. But so, I guess I'll fast forward to 2007, when I was introduced to my partner, Perry. So there's three of us who started the company, this guy, Perry, Yancey, and myself. Perry and Yancey had met like a year before, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine here in Chicago who's a developer, and it's like, hey, this was around the time when I had started my own studio. So I was independent, living in New York, and he's like, hey, are you still doing that strategy, information architecture, design thing, whatever? I was like, yes, I'm still doing that thing. And he's like, well, I've got this friend who's got a startup in Brooklyn. He's a friend of mine. Would you be interested? And I was like, yes, I could use another client. So sure. And so we made an introduction. So it turns out that Perry and this guy Scott had been freshman year roommates. So I say all this because it was sort of these accidental kind of random connections. And I don't think there was this, like Scott he knew about my subsistence side projects, but I don't think that was any reason why. It was much more pragmatic, kind of boring businessy stuff around, like, you're a designer, he needs a designer. But I think when I got on the phone with Perry the next day, and he was kind of going through it was a very, very high building, elevator pitch, meaning it was a long sort of description of what it was. And I remember kind of stopping him like a minute or two in and saying, I got it. I think I get what you're talking about. Like, not the nuts and bolts of it, but just the general gist of it. And why I bring that up is because I think when you're at that sort of amoeba stage where it is an idea, it might be written down, but there's nothing to show, and it doesn't exist. It's vaporware, literally vaporware. The usual look you get is this kind of blank, like, huh? What is it? And so I got that a lot, and so I understood why Perry was sort of going through this certain tone of description. But why I think why I say there's this connection between these little sort of half-witted projects that I was doing on the side, and Kickstarter was all about independence for the creative artist. And you can use that term very loosely, creative individual. And what I would argue is it was this moment of, I'll just be honest, like it was kind of this, oh shit, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Like, this is way better than all that shit that I was doing before, because it allows everybody to kind of support themselves and and get support from their community. Yeah, end scene.
That's a great story.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's interesting because there's a startup sitting right here in the second row that I met with earlier today. Yeah. And we were talking quite a bit about the relationship that you have with co-founders and creating kind of a corporate culture at the outset. And I don't mean that...
Or an anti-corporate culture.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you had this incredible... proverbial light bulb going on, or whatever it was, or confirmation or affirmation or something in Perry's description, yep. And you got it right away. When did you get it right away and describe that in working with Perry? Like, you know what I mean?
Oh, in terms of the collaboration as
yeah,
a part. Okay, so I was running my studio. I saw Perry as a client, to be honest, and I recognized that as a startup, he probably had very little money, fairly true. So I saw this as helping a friend, doing something creatively interesting for me, and certainly an awesome client to associate it with, at least in idea. And so I think it was probably Perry who suggested this, which was that we basically worked for a few weeks, sort of a gentleman's handshake. If at the end of the 3 weeks, Perry, I'm good, I sort of sucked in your brain and I can figure this out, I'll pay you some money and we'll get beers sometime, right? If at that juncture we say there's something more, well, let's talk about that. And so it was very open-ended. It was actually really easy. I would go to his apartment. I had a couple other clients at the time, but for the most part, it was in New York. I had one client in LA, so I'd bounce back and forth between New York and LA. But it was pretty casual, just a lot of brainstorming in his apartment, using his whiteboard, which he had in his apartment. Kind of weird. You know, a lot of it was me digesting a lot of what he'd been thinking about. So it's worth noting, so Perry, back in 2001, he had come up against something that instigated the thought process that eventually led to Kickstarter. So it was a long period of time of gestating this idea for him. Some active, some not, right, obviously. And so there was just a lot to kind of digest. And then there was me just sharing my own even history with this other project and understanding how to uphold and protect the creative integrity of the work that the creator was putting into their campaign. So, yeah, you know, we had breakfast one morning and said, hey, let's keep working together. I mean, it's sort of as simple as that. And then sort of typical of, I think, Perry and I, we only did the contract a couple of months later because the lawyers were telling us we needed to do an actual contract. So it was pretty easygoing, to be frank.
Oh, very cool.
You look like you have another question.
I do.
Okay.
So and I think you and I talked about this, that the whole concept of crowdfunding, I think there was a major obstacle that was out there, and I'd love for you to talk about that. And was there somebody else thinking or doing something similar at the same time?
Yeah, there was a few other. So the very first crowdfunding site was a site called Fundable. That I don't think they exist anymore, but they were like technically the first. I'll say that I'll just actually back up for a second and underscore this one bit, which was that, and maybe I should even just talk about that moment that Perry had in '01, because it's worth, I think, expressing the genesis of things, or at least I care about that. So you're gonna have to put up with me. We never talked about crowdfunding. Like, we didn't care about crowdfunding. What we cared about was empowering artists to deliver their work and keep ownership over that work, and do it in the way that was most innate to them. So I'll make this quick. But 2001, Perry was living in New Orleans, and there's an annual festival called Jazz Fest. And I'm sure Charlie can talk a little bit more about this, but jazz and electronic music actually have very close ties, right? And Perry wanted to throw a rave. Anybody remember raves, right? And R.I.P., maybe. And he wanted to basically throw an event down in New Orleans in conjunction with Jazz Fest, sort of on the periphery of Jazz Fest, as an expression of this sort of modern reference. And he had done what one does when they put on an event. They secured a space and got bouncers and the musicians and what have you. And then he started looking at what this shit was going to cost, and he kind of freaked out. Wasn't a guy that was made of money. Wasn't at all doing this for the money. It was really more of honestly an artistic expression in and of itself, and something that he just wanted to share. A music that he was very passionate about. He tinkered with making music for a while. Also a DJ. It's probably one of our little connections. And so the event never happened, and it really kind of ticked him off that it couldn't happen. And so he started looking around. Oh, surely there's a site somewhere or something that I could pre-sell tickets. So that was the impetus for this idea. And then obviously recognizing that there was nothing to support that. I don't know at what point he got serious about it and started looking up patents and forming the sort of documentation around the company. But at some point it sort of solidified.
Yeah, I mean, that's a long period of time, right?
Yep.
Just 2001 to 2007-ish?
2007 when I met him, 2006 when he met Yancey. And oddly, he met Yancey as, he he was waiting. Perry was waiting tables. He moved back to New York, where he grew up, and was waiting tables in Brooklyn, and befriended this guy, and eventually shared this idea that he had been working on with this guy Yancey, who was a writer and a rock critic. So again, kind of more cultural connection between the three of us.
So I love the description of Kickstarter, and not that it's crowdfunding, but
yeah, we never really talked about that. You know, I mean, we were definitely observant of what was happening. We certainly weren't naive, but it wasn't like we weren't in it for like to prove that crowdfunding could work. I mean, that was literally some of the dialogue, right? There was this theory that crowdfunding was a thing, and we just didn't like it. Didn't matter to us. It really didn't. I don't know. Repeat the question. There was something else in there. I feel like.
Well, I mean, it was just, you know, basically from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's more about empowering.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the sort of mechanism of crowdfunding was simply a solution to the bigger problem, which was about empowering basically the creative without access to capital.
So you had kind of this, so I mean, Perry had a very long sort of incubation period, you know, 4 or 5 years. Yeah. You come along, Yancey comes along, you come along. When did Vaporware become real software?
Yeah, so we launched on April 28th of 2009. So I guess it became more serious. So that was a 2-year period from when I came on to when we launched, which honestly was, as a guy who'd been doing this since '95, was pretty embarrassing. But we had some trials and tribulations with development that was interesting.
Tell us about those.
Right. So I guess how do I describe this story? When I came on board, there was already a team of developers that were working on this. They were connected to one of the guys and friends, like college friend of one of either Perry or Yancey. I honestly don't remember at this point. And it didn't work out. And that was lost time. Certainly, some capacity, lost money. I think we recouped at least quite a bit of, well, we recouped all of our equity. So that was, I think, one lesson. We had negotiated a deal with these guys where there was some, you know, we got a discount for some equity. And I think for a business, basically a studio, a development studio, whose focus is on monthly capital, we weren't all that attractive, right? The motivations weren't in line. And so I think that's one thing to just inherently recognize when starting a new company, venture, project, whatever, is that you're just aligned as incentive. And if those are out of whack, everything's going to be out of whack. So that was out of whack. And that didn't go so great. Then we'd gone a couple months looking for another team. I was pretty dedicated to basically hiring our own team. We'd come across and been introduced to another smaller studio. Did a little test project with them. We didn't particularly like it. Found another team that didn't work out, and then the sort of fourth go was magic.
How are you paying for all this stuff?
Friends and family, and freelance gigs.
So bootstrapping.
I guess, I mean, so I had, you know, not from an academic point of view. So we had raised some money, not a significant amount of money, but certainly to get us by. None of us were drawing a salary. So Perry and I were full in. Yancey was working, so he was sort of moonlighting with us at the time, and so we had no expenses, literally nothing, other than paying developers, and that was, you know, went through its period. So, and I think the second round, the second and third round, we were really smart in just in being very cautious about getting into those relationships and creating little tests to kind of feel out the relationship and feel out the work. So we didn't really spend a lot of money in that area.
So it was the fourth go around. You got your dev team.
Yeah, so that was actually what I'd sort of wanted from the beginning, I guess, at some capacity, which was just sculpting our own team. None of them had a connection between them. Their personal motivations were actually very much aligned, I think, with our personal motivations as individuals looking at a societal change that we were interested in. For example, like one of our engineers was in theater. Right. Another one was a traveler, but also an artist, and his mother was a painter, father was a photographer. And so it was, to me, that like all of that was all about empathy. So there was a deeper connection to the work that they were doing. Wasn't just about programming widgets all day, but it was actually about programming. The work that you were producing was actually going towards empowering somebody is the way I would sort of describe it.
I mean, tell us about the recognition of that in somebody. I mean, this isn't on somebody's resume.
Yeah, it's not somebody's resume. I mean, so this was actually something that I used in the hiring process as well. I would just have an open conversation with anybody. And some of these, I mean, the conversations with those first developers, Lance and Carson particularly, I mean, I think we would go on for like an hour and a half, not talking about code, but talking more about, I don't know, the world at large, or give me your background. I mean, honestly, no dissimilar from, minus the audience, than this, sort of digging into the past. Like, where do you come from? What interests you? And obviously, in some capacity, reviewing work. But the curiosity that I always had with the work was the stories behind the work. Like, what was it that went into it, not what it was. And so that actually, if we fast forward for a minute into sort of the modern era of Kickstarter, and this is actually something that Perry and I would talk quite a bit about, which was looking at how we worked when it was the two of us or the three of us or the six of us, including the developers, and figuring out as we grew, like how we could retain some of that, whatever that was. Which is hard as you're growing as an organization, obviously. But actually, there was a pillow that I Instagrammed back there. Do you remember what it said? Should I look it up on my phone? This was good. So this was. I'm actually gonna reflect on this as the growth of a company. Let's see. Bear with me, guys.
That's all right. I'll do a song and a dance.
No, here we go. I got it.
Thank God.
Thank you, iPhone. All right. So this is sort of a little bit of a non sequitur, but I'll bring it back. My career plans were much more exciting when I was 5. Right? How many can relate to that? So I think why I thought of that, why I bring that up is as a company we were infants, right? We were nothing. We were zero. We were an embryo in a womb or something like that. Vaporware period. And Perry and I recognized that we were going through this cycle where we would sort of psychotically design and redesign and redesign and redesign. And the notion where we got comfortable for a moment, when we recognized we were onto something, is when we started repeating ourselves over and over and over and over again. Oh, if we keep coming back to this, it's either the best we can do or it's the thing. And that's actually where Kickstarter...
And that was the thing.
That was basically the thing. I mean, it was... and I could get into the nitty-gritty of what I mean by the thing, but going back to the point about hiring and kind of holding on to that youthful moment, it was making sure that we don't get lost in the growth of the company and suddenly become to calcify, right? We become stuck in our own growth. And so there's a couple of things I could go off on tangents about. Like, we made a very strong effort not to grow very quickly. We made a strong effort not to grow limit our capacity of growth, how many employees were at the company, which is somewhat antithetical to our industry. And then I think the other piece was just trying to hold on to, like, what was it that made us work at the beginning? And how does that translate into a company that was then 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 people? Which is obviously different. It's not going to look the same, but what's the I don't know, intellectual abstraction of that.
How do you manage that throttle? I mean, if all of us could be so lucky that we're controlling our growth, but how do you manage that throttle? Like decide today that we only need 25 people.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that attracted me to Kickstarter in the first place, besides the cultural motivation, was the fact that there was an inherent business model. Like, we weren't going to hunt for it. So it's a transaction system, right? Effectively, right? Or we're utilizing one. That's the answer. I mean, that's essentially why we were able to manage our growth. We were in control of our own destiny because of, well, anyway, that's a whole nother thread, but we weren't growing to hit a certain velocity or number of users, and then like it wasn't a numbers game. It's just as simple as that.
Were there investors kind of peering over your shoulder at that time, or?
I want to say like a cute joke here, peering over our shoulders. No, I mean, so we eventually did 2 rounds of investment post launch, but no, they've been epically easy. It's easy to say that when we've had great growth and we're making a profit. We've not had to see the other side of that. So.
And so, yeah, very good. Early on, thinking back, and you mentioned a couple of guys you guys hired on early. Who do you think, beyond the co-founders, was your most critical addition to your team, and why?
That's not fair. I don't. So here's the way I would answer that. I'm not going to answer it directly because I don't think there is an answer to it. There isn't one person that stands out. I think everybody stands out, particularly in those early days when, I mean, my attitude was very appreciative that these people were willing to take the risk of working for us because, we didn't know what was going to happen next month. At least in those very, very early days. I will say this, there was this guy, Fred, who, I don't know, employee number 2, I think. He's still there. His previous job, he was a product manager at Creative Commons, which I'm not really sure what that means. Other people get the joke. But he's a brilliant guy, and he has since learned to code, but his biggest asset and something that he sort of fell into and stumbled into in those early days was analytics. We weren't doing a whole lot of analytics, and he became fascinated with this. He's now our analytics guy. It was certainly not a job that he was qualified for when he started, but he found his qualification through experience. So I, can relate to that, but B, I would say became significantly valuable through his flexibility. Yeah, I mean, I go back and I say that everybody that came on early on was magic, and I think everybody that's on now is magic. The difference is at 5 people, the impact is significantly greater, right, in terms of the cultural pool for the company.
That sort of, I asked you about culture.
Yeah.
And you said anti-culture. But
anti-corporate culture. It was a joke.
Did you guys formalize that in any way, or is it just, this is who we are? It was sort of a natural evolution of you guys getting together and building this company, or did you write something down and say, this is our manifesto?
Yeah, no, we didn't. We a year ago, I think we started writing our mission statement and all that kind of stuff. I think it was just in the water. The 3 of us came from very similar, I don't want to say similar backgrounds, but certainly similar cultural directions. Like, what we were interested in was always, underground music, outsider art, right? Like, there were things that were on the fringe. And I think even Kickstarter is a great expression of that, in that it's this is inaccurate, but I like saying it anyway, and that is that Kickstarter is the marketplace for the unmarketable, right? It's not something that you're going to find in the mainstream typically, right? And I think if you look at the scale of most projects on the platform, most people would agree with me, but they deserve to exist. And I think we've built up a society where more and more things can't exist like that. We sort of get into this homogenization of culture. Record labels have gotten so big that they can't take risks anymore. They're looking for the next name a big band, right? And I don't know about you, but that's not interesting to me. And that wasn't what I was listening to. That wasn't what I grew up with, be it independent electronic music or punk music. That's what drove me. That's what motivated me. And I think that was the thing that motivated. I know that was the bond that the three of us had. And so I think there was just a sort of an understood thing, a sort of unspoken trust. And we would talk about these things when we looked at hiring people too. Yeah.
Was there
very little rigor around sort of the corporatization of Kickstarter?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm getting a sense of
Yeah.
that. Did you ever fall in love with one of the projects early on? So I mean, you're building this platform, right?
Yep.
But you're seeing all of these cool, some not so cool, coming through.
Cool is subjective. Yeah, no, there's plenty of them. There was one, so, the early ones are usually the easiest because I think it goes back to, hey, everyone's taking a risk or they're experimenting. It was kind of this heyday of experimentation, and now there's a little bit more of a, I think sadly in some capacity, a rigor to a Kickstarter campaign. I always like those that kind of break out of the mold because that was always our intent anyway. It was a blank canvas. But there was this one project in particular that there's two, but I'll talk about this one. So this girl, Allison Weiss, she was a singer-songwriter, but she was a student at the time. She was going to school in Athens, Georgia, to be a graphic designer. And this was early days, like a couple of weeks, maybe 2 months in 2009. And at that time, we had known just about everybody that was on the platform. It was either somebody that we knew directly or somebody introduced us to or got them on the platform. And this girl had launched her campaign. She wanted $2,000 to fund an album. And so no biggie, although that was actually big money for us. Allison, she had posted her campaign, I think at like 10 o'clock in the morning or something like that. And by the next morning, she had hit her goal. And so that was our first like viral success, $2,000 in 24 hours. And she went on to raise like $7,000, which was crazy. So, I mean, this was like a crazy, crazy, crazy project for us.
Well, let me ask you this, though, and you certainly can, but was there, so you're sort of very attached and engaged with these early campaigns. When did you feel like I'm not trying to curveball you, but when did you feel like you were becoming disconnected from all the campaigns?
I don't know that I've ever really felt disconnected. There was definitely a tipping point where I didn't know every project that was going on. So that was a thing, I suppose. But, I think, if connected means like not knowing everything, then yeah, that happened. I don't know what time of our growth that happened, but it was kind of a slow burn, I guess. I think the bigger thing to point out was I think just innately I'm always interested in people's campaigns, mainly because it's not about the campaign itself, but it's more about the project that they're running it for. And I'm always bumping into anybody run a Kickstarter project in this room? One, cool. Last year, awesome, and another one in the back. So there you go.
Yeah, I actually, a startup that I mentor, QB, Fitness Cubed, raised $300,000.
Yeah,
that's top 10 in Chicago this year.
That's no small feat.
So I want to leave time for questions and everything, but let's talk about you leaving Kickstarter. Why?
So I'll say this: Kickstarter is definitely my baby, right? It was Perry's baby, it was Yancey's baby, it was honestly the whole company's baby. You know, obviously for some of us it had a little bit more significance than others, meaning the three of us as founders, not talking about equity, but just more about like we had the cojones to start this thing because we were that frustrated with the way the world was. And so it was really hard to leave. I think I'll sort of describe it in this way. I've been doing it for 7 years. I've been living in New York for 4 years. I have this innate itch that I can't help that makes me move every once in a while. So, you know, 3 or 4 years in New York, time to go. It wasn't like I was expressing that, but I think it kind of crept up. The other bit was my wife had said something to me which got me thinking quite a bit. And that was, so she had quit her job and she was basically a stay-at-home mom with our daughter. And she said, look, I want to go back to work or go back to school. I want to show our daughter that she, my wife, can do something more than just raise a kid, right? And that's fucking dope, and I want to be able to support that. I guess it just got me thinking about, you know, time on the planet. I was turning 40. I'm 40. I'm about to turn 41 in a few months. Fuck.
I wish I was 41.
Yeah, well, I wish I was something else too. But no, I'm happy with 41. Fuck it, it's great. I guess you know what I started thinking about was like, what else can I do? This thing was good. It was stable. I felt I wasn't done. Like, I don't know how others feel, but I think for me, I recognize. So my attitude towards design is it's this sort of psychotic act where it's never good enough, right? But at some point, you just need to stop. And it's hard because I think in many ways, like, Kickstarter is not where I want it in a couple of reasons, but it's there's definitely enough density around the company to get it there, right? And I'm not so egotistical that it needs to be me. Or I hope I'm not so egotistical that it needs to be me. So I felt like it was a reasonable time to go. I don't know, maybe I'm just dumb, but I left. Yeah, no, I think it was a long process. It was a long process. There's another thing that I would say was, I saw this. Anybody heard of this film 180 Degrees South? One person, 2 people, 3 people. Okay, cool. So I don't want to say that this like film changed my life, but it got me thinking about something that was really important to me, and that is the environment. And it's not to say that that's what I'm going to go and attack, but although that, who knows, because I'm a flaneur on Walkabout, but it just got me thinking, I suppose, about, like, again, like, what more can one do, and I don't know how much longer I get to be around, so, yeah.
Very cool. All right, why don't we open it up for questions? Yeah. All right.
Bueller?
Yep, right here.
We focus on what we do well. And I don't think we need to necessarily solve all of those problems, and that would then require us to grow more and do things out of our bounds. I would also argue that a lot of, there's a couple of answers in here, and that is a big portion of those constraints are around product design, which is only one category of the many on Kickstarter. And so it's what seems like it's certainly a problem, fulfillment. I shouldn't say a problem, but it's something to solve, but there's a delicate solution, which has to cover bounds from, you know, the guy who raises $500 or $5 for his art project to Scott Wilson, who's down the street, who raises just shy of $1 million, or the guys who raise, you know, more than that. And so that's like a massive scale issue, meaning a delta between A to B. And so I think we're still figuring that out, and we're making smaller little inroads into more around the communications around fulfillment, right? And I should say they, I don't work there anymore, right? So it's been a year, and actually a lot has happened in that realm in the past year. But, you know, but I guess I say that, you know, we don't have to solve every problem. I think the other side to it is, you know, there's something about, and this is, I think, my own personal view, but there's something about things not being easy that I think is great. And we learn a significant amount. It sort of tests our mettle as people. And so I like that. I personally like that tension that people go through, like watching them go through that tension. There's a great, actually, there's a very meta answer, perhaps. There's a film that was funded on the site called Indie Game the Movie. Anybody know Indie Game the Movie? This film actually almost brought me to tears because it was a very emotional reflection for me of the trials and tribulations that we went through at Kickstarter. But I would say in sort of the meta response to the answer is that it's very similar to a lot of Kickstarter campaigns, particularly those that hit this sort of like massive scale issue, or at least scale of success that's beyond their capacity, which is typically beyond what they initially wanted. So it's a good problem to have, right? Not the answer you're looking for, but you're still in business. My first question in the room when I met Perry was like, okay, who's the technical guy? So, you know who you know. And so the initial, we don't outsource anything now. We had started outsourcing earlier on, and it just didn't work. I think just going back to the motivation thing. We're not going to go through sort of the dating escapades of trying to find a technical co-founder. We just, and you got to remember the amount of time that Perry had been sort of sitting, like building this up. We just had to move, and it's why they went with the development team. And regardless of what happened with that, it was the right move at the right time. So I think the thing is, the easy takeaway is there's never a right answer. There's no right answers in anything. That's the sort of unfortunate part to this. Maybe the only takeaway, I guess, which sucks. But it's also kind of the brilliant, like there's a brilliant freedom in that, right? Which is you're going through it for the first time and you get to screw up just like everybody else has screwed up, but you also get to do it differently. So you hopefully get to learn from other people's mistakes. So maybe you learn from mine, but anyway. Yeah, I'll table and say, like, I don't know if it's the holy grail. It's an option, right? There's are we going to put grant organizations out of business for writing grants to artists and so forth? Like, no, those things still exist, and a lot of Kickstarter campaigns do both, right? Or artists who run Kickstarter campaigns do a campaign and then do other stuff. I guess I just go back to the very early days and point out that, hey, there were successes. There was an inkling of something, and it wasn't so much. I guess I would argue that maybe Alison Weiss and her project was an aha moment, just in the sense that it was outside of the scope of our friend network, and it worked better than most projects on the site. There's other aha moments where, like when Scott Wilson launched his campaign and just came shy of $1 million, like that was certainly an aha moment that we could hit a certain scale, and then when you start going over $1 million. Again, more scale. But I think the just going to the scale piece, the thing, and I don't know if this is so much the aha moment, but it's certainly a gratifying reflection, is that the majority of the site is still what it used to be, and that is it's independent artists raising $10,000, $20,000. I don't know if that's technically accurate, but thereabouts. And so I think that initial thing is still very much alive.
Yeah, I remember something, and this was probably a year, maybe 2 years ago, that the average successful campaign was just shy of $10,000.
Okay.
So you hear and read about, the $1 million campaigns, but most are not that.
Oh yeah, and I think that's how we can stay in business, honestly, because there's just if you're waiting for the spark to ignite. That's a risky business model, and so I think economically, those big projects are really nice, but they don't make the platform. It's everything else that makes the platform. It's all those projects that are raising, anywhere from we've had people raise $1 because you can, and that in and of itself was the joke and the art. But you know, those projects up to the $20,000, and then it sort of scales up. You know, you have six-figure projects and so forth. So.
Awesome. All right, everybody, let's give it up for Charles Adler. Thank you.